Pasuk Chavbeis, Medrash Agoda Hetakti, Misodo Sharamusha Darshan Nubzeu. Rashi citing the Medrash that Ramosha Darshan had cited, Vikho Elecho. They have to take the Paraduma, they have to buy it, purchase it with their own means. Bishelohem. Kishem Shem Pirku Nizme Azov Le'egel Mishalem, just as in the time of the golden calf. They removed their golden nose rings to provide the gold for the Egel. Identically, they have to contribute for the purchase of the Paraduma. They have to purchase it with their own means. Paraduma, has to be totally red. We said that even if it's two black hairs, it doesn't meet the standard of totally red. Moshel ben Shivcha, it's analogous to the child of a maidservant, Shetin of Paltan Shel Melech, who soiled the palace of the king. Omru, so they said to the mother, Omru tovu imov t'kaneh chatzoah. Let the mother come and clean up the feces of the child. Kach tovu poro, identically, let the cow come, uschaper le'egel, to atone for the calf. Therefore, it's a poro. The idolatry of the egel was a calf. The atonement, means to relieve, to atone for that, you need the poro, you need the mother. Adumah, what does Adumah? Why does it have to be red? What does red signify? Al Shem Shim Yadimu Katola. Jachet Kori Odom. We find that sin is always identifies as red. And it says in the Posuk Yeshaya that if a sin will be as red as a worm. So why did we reach that level of impurity? Because we did the Chet Egel, Tamima. Al Shem She Yisrael Tamimim. Before the Chet Egel, the Jews were considered perfect. As we said, the Gemara tells in Avodah Zorah. They ascended to a level where after they said Nasam and Nishma, to the state, priest Adam, eating of the tree of knowledge. Venasum Bali moving. And as a result of the Chet Egel, we became blemished. Tov Vuzuz Chapa Aleim. Let the Paraduma come and atone for them. The Yavzu Litmimusam. The Tamusam, they should return to their wholesomeness. Lo Le'ol. If any object was put on the Paraduma, it's disqualified. When they contributed to the Chet Egel, they had thrown off from themselves the yoke of heaven. Elazar Cohen oversaw this, the process. Aaron, just as they assembled around Aaron that he should make the Egel of their behalf. Because Aaron had actually engaged in the process of making the Egel. So the Paraduma, this Paraduma was not done through him. Because a prosecutor cannot be an advocate. The surface of Poro, afterwards he burned the Poro. When Moshe came down and he broke the luchos, it says he took the Egel, he pulverized it, and he burnt it. These three items, these three species, there were 3,000 casualties who died as a result of the Egel. The Erez who are Gavoa, we call Alonos. Ilonos, the cedar tree is the most majestic tree of all the trees. The Ezov Nomuch Kulam, and the hyssop grass is the lowest. It grows on the ground. Simin Shagavoa Shinizgoya, to teach us a lesson that a person has become arrogant and pompous. V'choto Yashva l'satzmo ke'ezov v'tobas, he should lower himself like this hyssop grass and like the worm, the scapulo. Only when he reaches that level of humility, only then will he have kapora. Limishmeres, now this is important, and you store away the ash of the paraduma limishmeres for safekeeping, for all those who are going to be contaminated in the future. As the sin of the Egel is held for all generations till the end of time. Sheilucha pekuda sheibo mipekuda seigel. Anytime Jew Klal Yisrael are punished in the future, part of the punishment is what is the punishment is as a result of the chet egel. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, "V'yo pokti upakarati." The day that I will acknowledge your sin in terms of retribution, retribution will come for that original sin, which is the chet egel. Shusha egel metame al oskibo, just as the egel contaminated those who were involved, engaged in it. Kach porah tetami kol oskibo. Identically, the porah also contaminates all those who engage in the process. Shem shenitru ba'afro, and just as then when Moshe Rabbeinu he used the ash of the egel when he gave them to drink, or he sprinkled it on them, it brought about a state of purity. Shenema v'yizer al pnei hamoyim, kach v'lokhu l'tomei mafes shreifes shematame achatos nosal mayim chayim. You put it on the water that comes from a living wellspring. As over there, there was a living wellspring. Here also. Now, I had asked them in the past, it says, Hashem says, by the chet egel will be opoked you for karati. When you'll be punished for any sin in the future, when there'll be a reckoning for any sin, part of the punishment will be for the original sin, the chet egel. The question is why? What is this all about? So we'd explained in the past is this. Before the chet egel, when Klal Yisrael received the Torah at Sinai, we ascended to a level of perfection that we were no longer affected by the chet of Adam Rishon, the chet of Deitz Hadas, the impurity of Deitz Hadas that Adam introduced into humanity no longer had relevance to us. And therefore, the Gemara says, Avodah Zarah, the Jews were no longer subject to death. We would have lived eternally. As a result of the chet egel, we reverted back to post-sin. The egel was the cause why we reverted back to post-sin. So the reason why we have relevance to death is because of what the chet egel. And this is the whole concept. Let the mother come and clean up after its child. Okay? Now, so it's interesting. If we would have never sinned with chet egel, there would be no such thing as what? A spiritual deficiency. We would have achieved a level of perfection. We would have been an eternal people, no longer subject to the Yetzer Hara after that. But because the chet egel, we reverted back to post-sin, as a result of that, death is reintroduced. We become limited, and therefore, because of that limitation, we're subject to the evil inclination, and we have relevance to chet. So every chet that we sin from then going to the end of time, why did we cross those lines? Why do we transgress? Why are we subject to those influences? Because initially we did the chet egel. So therefore Hashem says, whenever there'll be a reckoning on any sin in the future, part of the punishment for that sin will be the chet egel. Because if not for chet egel, you'd have no relevance to sin. So therefore they're inextricably connected. Sin chil Hashem is only because of the chet egel. If not for chet egel, therefore be opokti pakarati. Okay? That's the idea. And this is the concept of let the mother come and correct, clean up what the child soiled. And therefore the Parah Adumah is Matayar. That's how we understood, we explained it. So once had said that the Gemara tells us in Psochim that forgetting is a gift. That a human being is able to forget. Why? Because if a person would not forget when a loved one passes away, and you would experience the grief and the pain as that first moment for your whole life, you couldn't survive. As much as we believe that we remember and we're still grieving over whatever it is, from the moment the person passes away, the memory starts fading. That moment becomes less and less over time. Although you remember the event vividly and clearly, it's not the same. Hashem gave a gift of forgetting to humanity because otherwise humanity couldn't survive. So why do we forget? We forget because there's such a thing as death. So if the Jews would have never sinned with chet egel, and death would have not been subject to death, what would have been? The whole concept of forgetting would have no relevance to us anymore. Now, the Medrash says explicitly that when Moshe Rabbeinu, it's Gemara Avodah Zarah too, when Moshe broke the Luchos Rishonos, he broke the first tablets. The letters on the tablets were fire. As he broke them, the letters floated heavenward, which indicated that this is Shikchas HaTorah. And the Gemara says that if Moshe Rabbeinu would have never broken the Luchos, the Torah would have never been forgotten. Anything that you learn would have been blazoned on your heart, on your emotion, your memory, never to forget. But because Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, that's the reason why we're subject to forgetting. What is the understanding? Now, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, when Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, what does Hashem say to Moshe Rabbeinu? Asher shibarto. Asher shibarto, yiyasher kocho shibarto. I want to give a yashikoach, a great thank you that you broke the Luchos. Why? Because if Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't have broken the Luchos, he would have had to destroy Klal Yisrael. Because what is it analogous to? A woman gets married, and under the chuppah she commits adultery. That's what it is. So if that is the case, so the Luchos represent, that is the what? That's the marriage. The breaking of Luchos was an annulment of that moment. So because Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, and the connection was annulled, therefore, as a result of that, that's why Hashem did not destroy us. But if not for that, we would have been destroyed. So now that we were destroyed, now that they were broken, we revert back to post-sin. Now, what does the letters flowing heavenward represent? The forgetting of Torah. Because now that it's post-sin and now we're subject to death, forgetting has to be reintroduced to us. Because again, now that we're subject to that, you couldn't survive. Once we're subject to forgetting, it's across the board. Whatever we absorb, ultimately it's going to start fading unless you review it. So as a result of that, a result of the Shviras HaLuchos, which put us post-sin, because otherwise we would have been destroyed. Now we continue living as post-sin. Post-sin, you have to have forgetting. Once you have forgetting, therefore, now we speak about Shikchas HaTorah, because now we're part of humanity. So therefore, unless you continue to review, you will forget. And the Rambam rules in Hilchos Talmud Torah that until what moment does a person have to study Torah? Till the last moment of his life. Why? Because the Rambam says, because the moment you stop studying, the forgetting process starts immediately. And since you're not permitted to forget the Torah, therefore you have to continue studying or reviewing till the last moment. Otherwise, the human being subject to forgetting will affect us, and we're not permitted to forget what we studied. Why was it idolatry? The Chet was idolatry. Idolatry is a denial of God, that God is not the one who's the omnipotent one, that everything is him, nothing exists outside of him. This is the core of everything. This is Avodah Zarah. We were challenged at that moment. Is God the one and only, nothing exists outside of God? Or we need some kind of intermediary which has relevance to our existence? So there, the failing was at the core of where everything is founded on that belief. We failed. The Gemara tells us something very interesting. The Gemara tells us in Avodah Zarah that really, at the level we were at, we shouldn't have been tempted by the Chet Egel. We shouldn't have. We heard the 10 Commandments directly from Hashem. We said Nasa V'Nishol. So why did God give us that challenge of the Chet Egel? So the Gemara says, of course, God knew we would fail. He knew we would fail. Why did he know we'd fail? Because God knows the future. He knew the decision we'd make. But the reason why he gave us that challenge, knowing we would fail and we revert back to post-sin, to teach us a lesson. To teach us a lesson that even if a complete nation fails and the Chil Hashem is so extreme, if you do tshuva, you're worthy of atonement. Despite the enormity of the sin and the degree of Chil Hashem that exists. That's why Hashem gave that particular, that the whole Klal Yisrael should sin. And he knew we would fail, but the failure was our choice. But what is the takeaway? That despite that, we were forgiven. We received Luchas Shnios because we did tshuva and Moshe Rabbeinu supplicated on our behalf. We find David HaMelech failed with Bathsheba. David HaMelech himself was at a level that he said, Libi cholo b'kirbi. He destroyed his evil inclination. Why did the whole challenge with Bathsheba come about? So Mar tells us that we find that Hashem refers to Avram to Yaakov as Elokei Avram, Elokei Yaakov. David being the fourth leg of the Kisei HaKavod in the spiritual world, that's how special he was. It being fundamental to the profile of Klal Yisrael, even more than Moshe Rabbeinu, he wanted that he should be referred to as Elokei David, to identify him in terms of his value. So Hashem says to David, the only reason why the Avos merited that appellation, that classification, was because they withstood challenge. They were tested and they withstood the most severe challenges. That's why they merited to rise to that level classification of Elokei. Elokei Avram, Elokei Yaakov. The only way you could be referred to as Elokei, you have to meet a challenge, which probably you're not going to be able to succeed. So I suggest, in your best interest, don't go there. David says, I'm willing to take the chance. That's what David said to Hashem. I'm willing to take the chance. Hashem says, I don't think it's a good idea. You have free choice. But of course, Hashem knew he would fail. And as a result of that, he was presented with the challenge of Bathsheba. And it says he failed. And because he failed, therefore, as a result of that, he never achieved the classification of Elokei David. He was David. So Mara says, but if Hashem knew always he was going to fail, why did he give him that challenge? Why did he give him that challenge? So Mara says, because the takeaway is that a tzibur that sins at that level of Chil Hashem, the reason why they're worthy of forgiveness when they do tshuva, because they have such a thing as schus tzibur. There's the merit of a tzibur, but an individual who doesn't have that schus, maybe if he does tshuva, it's not sufficient. The takeaway from David is, even though there was a Chil Hashem at a certain level, nevertheless, if an individual does tshuva, Hashem is willing to forgive him. So Hashem allowed him to have that level of challenge, of temptation, although he knew he would fail. So the takeaway should be that even an individual does not have the schus of a tzibur, if he does sincere tshuva, Hashem will forgive him. So Klal Yisrael shouldn't have been tempted with the regel. But the takeaway should be that even a tzibur with the Chil Hashem is magnified endless times over. If they do tshuva, they're forgiven. So what do we need the individual? Because they have schus tzibur. Tzibur is a whole different dimension, but the individual not. And why the individual? Because the Chil Hashem is not at that level of a tzibur. So therefore, we need both events, that we should have both these takeaways, regardless of how great the Chil Hashem is. And even the one who doesn't have the schus tzibur, if he does sincere tshuva, Hashem will forgive him. Find that Moshe Rabbeinu on the 40th day, and he already has the luchos, he has the tablets to take him down. Hashem says, Lech rei kishiches amcha. You must go down immediately because your people have become corrupted. So there's a famous Chazal, Moshe Rabbeinu said, and Rashi cites in the Chumash, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem, my people have become corrupted. Since when they my people, not your people. So Hashem says to Moshe, when you took the rabble out of Egypt, did you consult with me? There were hundreds of thousands of rabble left Egypt. They were the fifth column. Did you consult with me whether you permitted to take them out? You never consulted with me. Therefore, what happened now is due that not consulting, and you allowed this level of influence to be in the midst of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, it's Amcha v'lo Ami. These people are your people, they're not my people. If it would have been up to me, I wouldn't have let them leave with the Jews. And as a result of that, there would have never been this level of influence which would have brought about this disaster. So comes up Moshe Rabbeinu, because he allowed this rabble to come out, that's what a Chet Egel came about. That's why it came about. And yet we find Moshe Rabbeinu is not culpable, and there's no claim against him, culpability-wise, that because he did let them out, he didn't consult with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The question is, why not? If the end result was disastrous beyond disastrous, that every Chil Hashem till the end of time is only as a result of the Chet Egel, and the Chet Egel only happened because of the rabble, why is Moshe Rabbeinu held accountable to some degree, and he's not? Ask the question, Mark.
Why was Moshe absolved from his grievous transgression of bringing the rabble, and Aaron was not?
Okay, first I want to make it clear. The word grievous has no relevance to Moshe Rabbeinu, and the word grievous has relevance to Aaron. Okay? I'm explaining this. The Gemara asks, why did Aaron allow himself to get involved? He knew that Moshe Rabbeinu was alive, and he knew this was wrong. So the Gemara tells us, the last mention of Hur was the nephew of Moshe and Aaron. That was the son of Miriam. When they prayed during the war against Amalek, it says Hur was on one side, Aaron was on the other side, holding up Moshe Rabbeinu's hands. After that, there's no mention of Hur. What happened to Hur? And Betzalel was the grandson of Hur. Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur, Lamata Yehuda. And why Betzalel, at the age of 13, why was he chosen to infuse with such a level of understanding that he understood the conjugation of letters, how creation came apart? Why did he merit such a special level that only through him the Mishkan was built? So the Gemara says in Avodah Zarah that when the rabble introduced and suggested, let's make this intermediary, Hur immediately protested. And he would not allow it. He says, unacceptable, I will not allow it. You know what they did? They killed Hur. Hur was murdered by the rabble. He was murdered. So when Aaron saw that Hur was murdered, he saw the mood at that moment that if he should try to prevent and not allow it, they're going to kill him. He'll be killed, even though he's Aaron. And if they kill Aaron, Aaron is a Novi and a Kohen. And we find that if anybody kills a Novi and a Kohen, they have both of those levels of distinction, they will never be forgiven, ever. So he wanted to put himself, take a chance that maybe this will be a delay tactic. And Moshe Rabbeinu will return in time, that ultimately it's not going to happen. Because if he protests now, they kill him, Klal Yisrael goes into the oblivion, they will never be forgiven. Better, I should put myself in a position where I may forfeit my share in the world to come because I'm doing this grievous act, but I'm willing to give up my world to come for the sake of a Klal Yisrael. That was his calculation. He knew he was doing the wrong thing, but it was worthwhile that he should never be forgiven, and Klal Yisrael should never be in a position never to be forgiven. His sin was, God says to him, you know something? That's my business, that's not your business. You have to do what you're supposed to do. It's not a valid calculation. It's not valid. It's flawed from get-go, and therefore you're held accountable. But it wasn't to the degree of what, he wasn't an idolater. The Klal Yisrael, they believed that intermediary was necessary. Aaron was purely the delay tactic, but to be involved, to bring them to that level, that's something which it cost them 2 sons. 2 of his sons died because of this. And initially all 4 were supposed to die. Moshe Rabbeinu, as we explained, as Ernie was mentioning, what we once mentioned, why did we go to Egypt? So one opinion in Durham is that when Avram was the victor and he defeated the 4 mightiest powers, and the king of Sodom had come with his people, and he says, give me the people, you take the spoils of the war, but the people I want back. What should have Avram have said at the time? I'm the victor, I'm taking them all, and I will bring them under the wings of the Shekhinah, they will be converted to monotheism. He did not. And because he failed at that moment, he did not bring them to monotheism, therefore we were subject to the Shibud Mitzrayim. We went to Egypt. So we only went to Egypt, which had irreversible consequences because Avram failed. Because Sodom ultimately was destroyed. Because they went from bad to worse, they had to be destroyed. But Avram, if he would have converted them to monotheism, it wouldn't have happened. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, why did we go to Egypt? This is Moshe Rabbeinu's calculation. Because you have an opportunity to convert people to monotheism pagans, and you don't. So now, where Parah is sending out hundreds of thousands of rabble who are pagans, if I have the ability to convert them to monotheism, I'm just repeating Avram's mistake. That was Moshe Rabbeinu's calculation, and therefore he felt it's not necessary to consult with Hashem, except there was one blind spot. What was the blind spot? When Avram Avinu would have converted these people to monotheism, although they had this background, there was no Jewish people yet. He was converting the whole world to monotheism. When Moshe Rabbeinu allowed this fifth column to enter into the midst of Klal Yisrael, there's a Klal Yisrael, and being Klal Yisrael, you have to be concerned of their level of influence. That someday they may be that level of influence and actually destroy Klal Yisrael due to that fifth column. That was the mistake Moshe made, but it wasn't a flawed calculation. It was an oversight. With Aaron, he knew what he was doing. That if factually they become idolaters, he's willing to forfeit a share in the world to come. That you have no right to do. That's why his act was grievous and Moshe Rabbeinu was not. That's the difference. Also, where Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Hashem is levavcha v'zlav zarecha. God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your children. So the Ramban says, we know what a foreskin is. That's physical. It's on the external part of the male organ. It's a covering. What does it mean? Hashem will circumcise the foreskin of your hearts and the hearts of your children. Orlas levavcha v'zlav zarecha. So the Ramban explains over there that pre-sin of Adam naturally only strived only for purity and holiness. As a result of the chet of the Eitz Hadas, when that entered into his being, there was a drive, an overwhelming desire for theft and for illicit sexual relations. He became consumed with this. That's when the challenge became. Speaking after coming Mashiach, where there'll no longer be an evil inclination. And we're only going to be inclined to serve Hashem 24 hours a day. And then naturally, we will serve Hashem as Adam would have if he wouldn't have eaten of the tree of knowledge. That's the Rambam. So the circumcision of the heart, that's the covering, that's the blind spot. This is the desire, the inclination to be driven and drawn to that. That will no longer exist at the time after the coming of Mashiach. And he quotes a pasuk where Shlomo refers to those days as Yomim she'ein bohem chayfetz. Those days no longer have value. What does it mean? The only reason why our actions have value is because there's a challenge, as the Rambam writes in Hilchos Tshuva, when we do the wrong thing is because we chose to do the wrong thing. And we do the right thing is because we chose. So the yes and the no is attributed to our own initiative, because we have the ability to take charge of our life. So therefore, we're deserving of the reward, and we're culpable when we fail. However, when Mashiach comes, there are no longer challenges, because that what draws us to that will no longer exist. Therefore, it's Yomim She'ein Chayfetz. Those days no longer have the value any longer, because if there's no challenge, your accomplishment, since it comes natural, it's not attributed to you. That's the Ramban. Certainly remember, they said about Abraham, you should remember something else we learned. The Sforno says, what was the Chet Egel? That the Jew made silent and allowed it to happen. Right. If the rabble would have killed Aaron and allowed it to happen, they would have been held culpable for Aaron's death. So it would have been as if they killed Aaron, who was a Kohen and a Navi. It's the silence. It's the inaction that they would have remained passive and not intervene and not allow it to happen.
But we never see any place where someone is guilty of murder if he just stays silent and why?
There's a negative commandment. Lo samer al dam reyecho. If you see your fellow Jew drowning or being attacked, and you have the ability to intervene and you don't, it says there's culpability. That's called the bizraya de ritzicho. That's a semblance of committing murder. If you could have prevented a person's life from being taken and you did not, you're held accountable as if you killed him. The Beis Din will not put you to death. But in God's eyes, there's a very severe level of culpability, as if you caused that person to die. You participated in that person's death.
So what was the punishment for the killing of Hur? from there was no punishment for anybody there.
You want to know something? After we failed with Egel, maybe, it also was terrible. It was terrible.
Yeah,
But Hor wouldn't have been the liability of Aaron. Aaron, because he was a coin and Novi. There may have been a liability. You should have prevented it from happening. But Aaron's, if they would have killed him, that would have been unatonable. And we spoke about this. It's an Orach Chaim HaKodesh we had by Suri Menu. It says Suri Menu lived 7, 20, 100 years. She lived 127 years. Then it says, Elu Yemei Chai Sora. These were the years of Sora. Well, it's a question Rashi himself addressed immediately. If she lived 127 years, evidently, this was the life of Sora. So seemingly the closing statement of the pasuk is totally superfluous. So Rashi says in the Medrash, the Kulam Latova, all the years, the 227 years, although you may see it as negative, there were times where she was taken by Parah, and there were other times where he was thrown into the kiln. Everything turned out, every event was crucial to the total conclusion. Therefore, all the years of sorrow, Kula Latova. That's Eli Mechai Sorrow. That's Rashi. The Orach Chaim over there, Kodesh, cites the Midrash. There's a question, was Sarah meant to live only 127 years? She was not meant to live longer. It's only she passed away only as a result of being informed by the Satan that Yitzchak was being slaughtered. Oh, no, she was meant to live many more years, except her life was cut short because of the information which Satan had given her. So he's going according to the opinion that it was cut short. So it comes out, if Sarah Menu would have lived those additional years, how much more would she accomplished? No question, she would accomplish minimally what she did until that point, and even gone beyond, because she herself would have advanced in her spirituality. So you could say, to a degree, it's not fair. If she would have lived longer, she would have been accredited, she would have another level. Because Hashem took her before her time, she was denied all that opportunity. So you know what the Torah is saying? And the Orach Chaim HaKodesh says, and this is the way Hashem treats his chasidim and his tzaddikim, that even though you didn't live those years, because you're not there any longer, nevertheless, you're accredited for all those years as if you lived them, because if you would have lived them, you would have achieved what you would have achieved. And God knows what you would have achieved. So the person's fully accredited. That's the Orach Chaim. That's the conclusion. Not only was she accredited for 127 years, she was even accredited for the years that she did not live. Okay? So Rabbi Soslavta says, until Mashiach comes, we have the challenges. Let's say a person met all the challenges, met many challenges. Now, all of a sudden, the evil inclination is taken out of commission. We're no longer challenged. However, those additional years till the end of time, Hashem treats us or deals with us as if we would have the equal inclination, and therefore we're accredited for those years as if we achieved them. So as a result of the shleimus, what it does to our souls, we continue advancing, although we no longer have the evil inclination. Because the reason why we don't have the challenge is not because of us, because it's no worse than the person dying. Therefore, you're fully accredited for all those years. So the same thing. If Adam wouldn't have sinned, he would have always been classified a person, no matter what challenge you give him, he meets the challenge. So Adam continues to advances within a context of challenge, although he's no longer challenged. And that's all humanity. Okay, Alan, you hear it.
Yes, so that means you would have, so if I'm going back on Kategel, in other words,